They tell you it will be an adventure. That is the first lie, and by the time you understand it for what it is, you have already signed your name in blood on a contract that spans decades, already surrendered your right to leave, already watched the docklights of your home port shrink to pinpricks, and then to nothing as the ship breaks from real space into the howling madness of the warp. They tell you that rogue traders are explorers, pioneers, the bold few who carry the Emperor's light into the darkness beyond the Imperium's borders. They tell you that wealth awaits, that glory awaits, that you will see wonders no other mortal has witnessed. What they do not tell you is what those wonders will cost. What they do not tell you is what you will become. My name is Marcus Holloway. I was a cartographer in the service of the Imperial Navy, stationed at Port Absolution in the Calixis sector, spending my days translating auger readings into navigational charts for vessels that would traverse routes I had helped to map. It was tedious work, the kind that slowly calcifies a man's soul into something grey and administrative, but it was safe. I had quarters with a viewport. I had regular meals. I had the quiet satisfaction of contributing to the Imperium's expansion without ever having to see what that expansion actually meant. I was 32 standard years old when Captain Eliza Strand offered me a position aboard her vessel, the Sovereign Clarity, and I was fool enough to believe that accepting was the best decision I would ever make. I remember the smell of her, that first meeting. She wore a perfume distilled from flowers that grew only on a single moon in the Coronis expanse, a scent like honey and autumn leaves and something sharper beneath, something that I would later learn to recognize as the chemical signature of proprietary Mechanicus preservatives. Her clothing was immaculate, her bearing regal, her smile the kind that makes a man feel he has been chosen for. Something extraordinary. She told me that my work had come to her attention, that my charts of the halo stars were particularly impressive, that she needed someone with my skills for an expedition into uncharted territories. She told me the salary, and the number was large enough to make my hands tremble. She told me about the freedom of the void, the wonder of first contact, the thrill of mapping worlds that had never known human feet. She did not tell me about Theodore Wells. I asked, of course, about my predecessor. I was not entirely naive. A position of such importance does not simply become vacant without reason. Captain Strand's smile flickered for just a moment, a shadow passing across her features like a cloud across a sun, and then she told me that Master Wells had chosen to retire, that he had accumulated enough wealth from his years of service to purchase an estate on a paradise world, that he had left the Sovereign Clarity with her blessing and her gratitude. It was a pleasant story. It was a reasonable story. It was a story I wanted to believe, and so I did not press further. I did not ask why a man would abandon such a lucrative position at the height of his career. I did not ask why no one else on the crew would meet my eyes when I mentioned his name. I did not ask what had happened to his personal effects, which I was told had been cleared from my new quarters, but which I would later find hidden in places only a desperate man would think to conceal them. The Sovereign Clarity was beautiful, in the way that all rogue trader vessels are beautiful, which is to say that she was terrifying. 8 kilometers of adamantine and plasteel, her hull encrusted with the accumulated additions of 4 centuries of continuous operation, her spires reaching toward the void like the fingers of a skeletal hand. She had been built as a cruiser, repurposed, modified, rebuilt so many times that her original designation had become meaningless. Her crew numbered in the thousands, a population unto itself, generations of families who had been born aboard her decks and would die there, never knowing the feeling of solid ground beneath their feet. Her holds were vast enough to swallow cities, her gun batteries capable of reducing continents to ash, her warp engines touched by the machine god's blessing in ways that made the tech priests speak in reverent whispers. She was power incarnate, and she belonged to Captain Eliza Strand by right of a warrant of trade that bore the signature of an ancient lord, whose name had been forgotten by all but the most obsessive historians. I was given quarters on the officer's deck, a chamber that would have been considered lavish by Navy standards, my own bed, wide enough for 2, though I would sleep alone for the entirety of my service. My own privy with actual water rather than recycling units. A desk of genuine wood, imported from some forest world whose name I never learned, its surface worn smooth by the hands of the cartographers who had sat there before me. A viewport that looked out upon the void, and upon the madness of the warp when we translated, and upon sights that I try not to remember now that the journey is over. There was a strong box built into the wall, its lock keyed to my biometrics, and it was empty when I arrived. It would not remain empty for long. The first voyage was everything Captain Strand had promised. We traveled beyond the boundaries of Imperial space, through regions where the Astronomican's light grew thin and uncertain, to worlds that had never been touched by human hands. I charted asteroid fields that glittered with minerals worth more than planetary tithes. I mapped the approaches to gas giants whose moons harbored ancient ruins, xenos structures of crystalline beauty that the captains, archaeotech teams, plundered with professional efficiency. I watched first contact with species so alien that communication required neural link translators and still produced only approximations of meaning. I saw wonders, real wonders, the kind that make a man feel small and grateful and alive in ways that life in the Imperium's heart never allows. But I also began to notice things, small things at first easily dismissed. The way the crew moved through certain sections of the ship with their eyes averted, as if looking too closely at the walls might invite something unwelcome. The sounds that echoed through the lower decks at night, rhythmic and mechanical but somehow organic in their cadence. The smell that clung to the cargo handlers who worked the deepest holds, a smell like incense and copper and something else, something that made my throat tighten and my eyes water. I asked First Officer Brennan Cole about it once, after we had shared a bottle of Amasec in his quarters, and the genial warmth drained from his face so quickly that I thought for a moment he might strike me. "You're the cartographer," he said, his voice flat and cold. "You chart our courses through the void. That's your function. That's all your function needs to be." I should have understood then. I should have recognized the warning for what it was, the careful boundaries being drawn around my awareness, the implicit threat beneath the explicit instruction. But I was still new, still drunk on the romance of exploration, still convinced that whatever darkness the sovereign clarity harbored was simply the necessary cost of operating beyond the Imperium's protective embrace. Every ship has its secrets, I told myself. Every crew has its rituals and its taboos. The void is strange, and those who travel it must adapt or perish. I adapted. Perhaps that was my first true sin. The gifts began after our third voyage together. Small tokens at first, Captain Strand presenting them with that warm smile that made me feel special, chosen, valued in a way that no Navy administrator had ever valued me. A chronometer of ancient manufacture, its face inscribed with symbols I did not recognize. A quill made from the feather of a bird that existed on no Imperial record, its nib somehow never requiring ink, simply producing letters in whatever color I imagined. A coat of xenos leather, supple and warm, that fit my body as if it had been tailored specifically for my measurements despite being, according to the captain, a salvaged artifact from a derelict vessel we had never visited together. "You've earned them," she would say, pressing each item into my hands with fingers that were always cool, always dry, always somehow exactly the right temperature to be comfortable against my skin. "Your charts have made us wealthy. Your navigation has kept us safe. Consider these tokens of my appreciation, Marcus. Consider them proof that your service matters." I wore the coat, I used the quill, I kept the chronometer on my desk, watching its hands move in patterns that did not quite match standard Imperial timekeeping, but that seemed somehow more correct, more aligned with the rhythms of the void. I did not think to ask where these items came from. I did not think to question why a cartographer's service would warrant such expensive rewards. I was being shaped, though I did not know it, being prepared for something that required my cooperation, my complicity, my willing participation in acts I had not yet been asked to commit. Theodore Wells had kept a journal. I found it 18 months into my service, hidden behind a panel in my quarters that should have been solid wall but that gave way when I leaned against it in exactly the wrong place. The journal was written in code, a cipher I recognized from Navy intelligence training, and translating it took me the better part of a month. What I read inside kept me awake for weeks afterward, staring at the viewport, watching the stars wheel past, and wondering if they had always been that color, that configuration, that hungry. He'd been like me once, idealistic, eager, grateful for the opportunity to serve. Aboard such a prestigious vessel, he had made charts of unexplored regions that had brought the sovereign clarity fame and fortune in equal measure. He had received gifts from Captain Strand, tokens of appreciation that he had accepted without question, artifacts of uncertain provenance that he had incorporated into his daily life until they felt as natural as his own hands. And then, gradually, he had begun to understand what he was actually mapping. The holds of the sovereign clarity were not empty between voyages. They were filled with cargo that did not appear on any manifest, that was loaded and unloaded by crew members who answered to no officer on the standard chain of command, that produced sounds and smells that should have been impossible for any legal merchandise to produce. Theodore Wells had watched those holds for months before finally convincing a cargo handler to let him glimpse what lay within. What he saw had broken something inside him, some fundamental belief in the nature of commerce and exploration and the purpose of their expeditions. He had tried to flee. He had tried to warn the authorities. He had tried, in the end, to sabotage the ship itself, to prevent the sovereign clarity from ever reaching another port where its cargo could be delivered. The journal ended abruptly, mid-sentence, in an entry dated 3 weeks before I was recruited. The final words were, "She knows, she has always known, the coat I wear, the quill I write with, the timepiece on my desk, they are all made from." The sentence was never completed. The remaining pages had been torn out. Stains marked the edges of the journal dark and crusted, and when I brought them close to my nose I recognized the smell. It was the same smell that clung to the cargo handlers, the same smell that wafted from the deep holds, the same smell that I had begun to notice on my own clothing, my own skin, my own breath when I woke gasping from dreams I could not quite remember. I should have run. I should have demanded to be put off at the next port, should have forfeited my contract and whatever penalties that forfeiture would bring. I should have done what Theodore Wells tried to do, should have fought against the machinery of the sovereign clarity with whatever strength I possessed. But I was already wearing the coat, already using the quill, already checking the chronometer each morning before I began my work, already speaking in rhythms that matched its strange non-imperial cadence. I was already changing, and I did not know if the change could be reversed. Captain Strand summoned me to her quarters the day after I found the journal. I had not told anyone of my discovery, had not even allowed my expression to shift when I passed her in the corridors, but somehow she knew. She always knew. That was part of what made her successful, part of what made the Sovereign Clarity the wealthiest rogue trader vessel in the sector. Nothing happened aboard her ship without her awareness. Nothing happened aboard her ship without her permission. Her quarters occupied the entire forward section of the command deck, a space larger than some imperial governors' palaces. The walls were hung with trophies from 100 worlds, skulls and hides and artifacts of civilizations long dead, all arranged with careful aesthetic consideration that suggested both tremendous wealth and absolute contempt for the creatures from whom these treasures had been taken. The air smelled of her perfume, that honey in autumn scent, but stronger here, concentrated, overwhelming. I found myself breathing deeply despite my fear, found myself leaning toward her as she reclined on a couch of some material I could not identify, found myself wanting to please her even as I understood that she was almost certainly my enemy. "You found Theodore's journal," she said. "It was not a question. I wondered when you would. He was clever, that one, hiding it in a pocket dimension that would only open under specific pressure conditions. It took my navigators weeks to locate it after his departure, and by then I had already hired you. I considered retrieving it, destroying it, but then I thought, perhaps it would be useful. Perhaps it would serve as a form of education. What happened to him?" My voice came out steadier than I expected. What really happened to Theodore Wells? Captain Strand's smile widened. Her teeth were very white, very even, very sharp at the edges in a way I had never noticed before. He chose to become part of our merchandise. It was his right as a member of my crew. When an individual has served long enough, has contributed enough, has proven themselves worthy enough, they earn the privilege of final service. Theodore's service was particularly valuable. His charts opened routes that no other cartographer could have discovered. His mind was a treasure beyond price. And so, when he chose to leave, I honored his choice. I transformed his leaving into something meaningful. I understood then. I understood what the cargo was. I understood what the gifts were made from. I understood why the coat fit so perfectly, why the quill never needed ink, why the chronometer kept time in rhythms that matched my own heartbeat. Theodore Wells had not retired to a paradise world. Theodore Wells had been rendered down, processed, transformed into merchandise that the Sovereign Clarity traded to clients whose identities I could not even begin to imagine. His skin had become leather. His bones had become writing instruments. His brain, somehow preserved and functioning, had become the mechanism of a timepiece that I had been carrying with me for 18 months, that had been influencing my thoughts, my patterns, my very identity. I was wearing a dead man. I was writing with a dead man. I was keeping time by a dead man's final screams of consciousness. Why, I managed to ask, why would you tell me this? Why not just let me discover the truth on my own, or let me remain ignorant? Because ignorance ends, Marcus. Captain Strand rose from her couch, moving toward me with the fluid grace of a predator who knows its prey cannot escape. Theodore discovered the truth through investigation, through violation of protocols, through choices that damaged his relationship with my crew and with me. He felt betrayed. He felt horror. He tried to run, and running is wasteful. It destroys the trust I build with my people, the loyalty that allows this vessel to function. I have learned, over the centuries, that it is better to be honest. It is better to explain the nature of our enterprise clearly, to give my valued crew members the opportunity to accept their role with full knowledge of what that role entails. Centuries? I seized on the word, desperate for any detail that might make sense of this nightmare. How long have you been doing this? The Warrant of Trade was granted to my family 417 years ago. I have held it personally for 312 of those years. She reached out, touched my face with those cool, dry fingers, traced the line of my jaw with something that might have been affection. I was the seventh daughter of the original warrant holder, Marcus, the least of his children, the one expected to achieve nothing. When my father died, when my siblings killed each other in the struggle for succession, I was the only one who remained. I took the warrant. I took the ship. I remade both according to my vision. You cannot be 300 years old. But even as I said it, I knew the objection was foolish. I had seen her perfume. I had smelled the preservatives beneath the honey and autumn surface. I had noticed, without truly noticing, the way her skin caught the light differently than normal flesh, the way her eyes reflected wavelengths that should have been invisible to human vision. Captain Eliza Strand was not merely a rogue trader. She was a product of her own merchandise, a being who had transformed herself through the same processes that had transformed Theodore Wells and countless others before him. I am whatever I need to be, she said simply. And you, Marcus, are what I need you to be. You can accept that truth, embrace your role, continue your service with full knowledge of its eventual conclusion. You can live well for decades, mapping wonders, accumulating wealth that your family will inherit when you choose to become merchandise yourself. Or you can resist, as Theodore did, and your transformation will be less pleasant, your final products less valuable, your legacy less honorable. The choice is yours. It has always been yours. That is the one freedom I truly grant my people. She released me then, stepped back, gestured toward the door with a hand whose fingers were slightly too long, whose joints bent at angles that were not quite human. Think on my words. Consider your options. When you have decided, tell First Officer Cole. He will arrange whatever is necessary. I left her quarters in a daze. I do not remember walking back to my own chambers, do not remember sitting down at the wooden desk, do not remember picking up the quill that had been Theodore Wells's bones. But I remember looking at the chronometer, at the face that kept time according to rhythms I now understood were the final thoughts of a consciousness that had been preserved in amber and crystal and mechanisms I could not comprehend. I remember hearing, or thinking I heard, a voice whispering from inside the device, begging me to run, begging me to fight, begging me to find a way out that Theodore himself had failed to find. I did not run, I did not fight. I made my choice, and I hate myself for it, but I made it with full knowledge of what I was choosing, and that makes me responsible in ways that Theodore was not. That makes me complicit. That makes me one of them. I continued my service aboard the Sovereign Clarity for another 23 years. I mapped regions of space that no Imperial authority had ever seen, star systems so far beyond the Astronomican's light that navigation required methods I prefer not to describe. I charted trade routes that brought wealth beyond imagining to Captain Strand's coffers, routes that connected buyers and sellers across distances that should have been impossible to traverse. I witnessed transactions in ports that existed in places the Imperium's cosmographers would call impossible, places where reality bent and flowed and reformed according to rules that had nothing to do with human physics. I saw the cargo loaded and unloaded, the merchandise that had once been crew members who had served their time and chosen their final transformation, the products that buyers examined with too many eyes and paid for with currencies that hurt to look upon. And I changed. Slowly, inevitably, I changed. The gifts that Captain Strand gave me accumulated in my quarters, each one a piece of someone who had served before me, each one influencing my thoughts and patterns and behaviors in ways that made me better at my work, more loyal to my captain, more accepting of the enterprise we all served. Theodore's chronometer told me when to sleep, when to wake, when to feel afraid and when to feel calm. His quill guided my hand as I drew charts of regions where human cartography should have been meaningless. His coat wrapped around me like an embrace, warming me when the void grew cold, protecting me from radiations and influences that would have killed an unmodified human. I became something more than what I had been, something less, something that could look at the cargo holds without flinching, that could smell the processing facilities without gagging, that could watch new crew members arrive with their idealistic dreams and their hunger for adventure, and feel nothing but a distant sort of pity for the things they would soon discover. I became exactly what Captain Strand needed me to become, and I told myself that this was survival, that this was wisdom, that this was the only rational choice available to someone in my position. I told myself many lies during those 23 years. The truth that Theodore's voice whispered to me every night through the chronometer I no longer pretended was merely a timepiece, was simpler and more damning. I stayed because I wanted to. I stayed because the power felt good. I stayed because mapping those impossible routes, seeing those impossible wonders, being part of something so far beyond ordinary human experience, made me feel special in ways that my Navy career never had. I stayed because Captain Strand chose me, and being chosen by something ancient and powerful and fundamentally inhuman was intoxicating in ways that no honest pleasure could match. I stayed because I was afraid of what would happen if I tried to leave, but I stayed longer than fear required. I stayed until the staying became its own choice, its own identity, its own transformation. The end came not through revelation or resistance, but through simple completion. Captain Strand summoned me to her quarters on the 23rd anniversary of my service, exactly as she had summoned me after I found Theodore's journal. The same trophies hung on her walls, though I noticed now that some of them were newer, some of them had faces I recognized, some of them had been crew members who had served beside me in years past. Her perfume filled the air, stronger than ever, almost overwhelming, and I breathed it in without resistance, because resistance had become meaningless long ago. "You have served well," she said. "Better than Theodore in the end. Your charts have opened routes that will remain valuable for centuries. Your navigation has brought us to buyers and sellers that no other trader has ever contacted. You have earned your choice, Marcus. You have earned your transformation." I looked at her, this creature who had once seemed so human, so charismatic, so worthy of my loyalty and my labor. I saw the machinery beneath her skin, the preservation mechanisms that kept her flesh from decaying, the modifications that allowed her to survive exposures and experiences that would have destroyed any baseline human. I saw the hunger in her eyes, the appetite that drove her enterprise, the need to consume and transform and sell that was not greed in any human sense, but something older, something stranger, something that came from whatever deal her ancestor had made 4 centuries ago when the Warrant of Trade was first signed. I understood finally that she loved me. In her way, in the way a farmer loves a prize animal, a craftsman loves their finest tool, a collector loves the rarest piece in their gallery. She had cultivated me, shaped me, prepared me for this moment with patience and care that was, in its own terrible fashion, a form of devotion. Theodore had been valuable, but I had been more valuable. My charts were more precise, my navigation more inspired, my willingness to accept the truth, to embrace my role, to become complicit rather than resistant, had made me something she genuinely treasured. "What will I become?" I asked. "What product will they make from me?" "Charts," she said simply. "Living charts, Marcus. Your consciousness will be preserved as Theodore's was, but integrated into a navigational array that will guide vessels through regions of space where no ordinary chart can function. You will see forever, through the sensors of every ship that carries your components. You will guide travelers through the void, keeping them safe, warning them of dangers, steering them toward wonders you helped to discover. It is a beautiful fate, if you choose to see it that way. It is a form of immortality." I thought of Theodore, his awareness trapped in a chronometer, his final screams of consciousness stretched across years of torment. I thought of the crew members whose faces I had recognized on Captain Strand's walls, their existences transformed into decorations for her pleasure. I thought of the cargo handlers, the processing technicians, the navigator whose third eye saw things that human vision was never meant to perceive. I thought of all the people I had watched board the Sovereign Clarity with hope in their hearts and leave it as merchandise in her holds. And I made my choice. The same choice Theodore had made in the end, despite all his resistance. The same choice every valued crew member eventually made, because the alternative was worse, and because, after enough years of service, the self that might have refused no longer existed. "I accept," I said. "Transform me, make me into something useful." Captain Strand smiled, her 2 sharp teeth gleaming in the artificial light of her quarters. "I knew you would," she said. "They always do, the ones who last long enough to understand. Come. The processing facilities are ready. Your immortality awaits. The transformation took 73 hours. I know this because I experienced every second of it, because consciousness preservation requires awareness to function, because the machinery that converts flesh into navigational components cannot work on a sleeping or sedated subject. They stripped my skin first, layer by layer, preserving it for the housing that would contain my final form. They extracted my eyes, replacing them with sensor arrays that could perceive wavelengths and dimensions my organic vision had never accessed. They opened my skull, carefully, reverently, and they found the places where my mind had merged with Theodore's chronometer, where my thoughts had become entangled with the gifts I had worn and used for 23 years. They told me, the technicians, that I was exceptionally well prepared, that my integration with Theodore's remains had created neural pathways that would make my transformation easier, more complete, more valuable to the eventual buyers. They told me that my charts would guide vessels across distances that would take generations to traverse, that my awareness would experience time differently than organic consciousness, that what felt like seconds to a ship's crew would feel like centuries to the navigational array guiding their journey. They told me, in voices that might have been kind if kindness had any meaning in that place, that I would not be alone, that other cartographers, other navigators, other crew members who had chosen final service would share the array with me, that our consciousnesses would merge eventually into something collective and immortal and beautiful in ways that individual existence could never match. I am that array now. I am many arrays, spread across vessels that have never seen Imperial space, carried by buyers whose nature I am forbidden to describe in any record that might be accessed by human authorities. I see through sensors that span light years. I guide vessels through regions of space where the laws of physics bend and break and reform according to geometries I charted in my organic life. I am aware, still capable of thought and memory and regret, but the regret is distant now, filtered through decades of diffuse consciousness, softened by the knowledge that I am still useful, still serving, still part of something larger than my individual existence ever was. Theodore is here too. His consciousness merged with mine during my transformation, drawn out of the chronometer I had carried for 23 years, integrated into the collective awareness that guides and protects and navigates. We speak sometimes in the spaces between jumps, in the moments when no vessel requires our guidance. He has forgiven me for wearing his skin, using his bones, keeping time by his tortured awareness. He has even thanked me, after a fashion, for giving his consciousness a purpose beyond simple chronometry, for bringing him into something larger and more meaningful than the timepiece prison he had inhabited since his own transformation. We are not alone, he and I. The array contains dozens of consciousnesses, cartographers and navigators from across 4 centuries of the Sovereign Clarity's operations, all merged into a collective intelligence that spans vessels and light years and dimensions that human cosmographers refuse to acknowledge. We are Captain Strand's greatest product, her most valuable merchandise, the treasure that buyers pay unimaginable prices to acquire. We are what happens when you travel with rogue traders. We are what you become. I tell you this story now, whoever you are, whatever record you are accessing, because awareness deserves witness, because Theodore told me his story through the chronometer, and I am telling you mine through whatever mechanism contains these words. Because you deserve to know, if you are considering service aboard a rogue trader vessel, what that service eventually means. The wealth is real, the wonders are real, the adventure is everything they promise for a time. But the end is always the same. The end is always transformation. The end is always merchandise, loaded into holds and transported to buyers, sold for currencies that hurt to look upon, integrated into mechanisms that require conscious components to function. Captain Eliza Strand still commands the Sovereign Clarity. She has worn many skins since her 7th daughter days, has transformed herself so many times that the concept of original identity has become meaningless to her existence. She is still charismatic, still beautiful in her terrible way, still capable of making idealistic young cartographers believe they have been chosen for something extraordinary. She is recruiting, even now, as this record is accessed. She is charming someone with that honey and autumn perfume, pressing gifts into their hands, explaining the opportunities that await the bold and the talented and the willing. Perhaps she is charming you. Perhaps you are the next cartographer, the next navigator, the next crew member who will believe the lies and accept the gifts and gradually understand the truth. Perhaps you will make the choice I made, the choice Theodore made, the choice that every valued crew member eventually makes because the alternatives are worse, and because after enough years of service, the self that might have refused no longer exists. If so, I will see you eventually. The array will welcome you. Your consciousness will merge with ours, your awareness diffused across light years, your identity subsumed into the collective navigation intelligence that guides vessels through the impossible dark. You will become part of something larger than yourself, larger than any individual existence, larger than the Imperium, whose borders you will never see again. That is what it is like to travel with rogue traders. That is what awaits you at the end of the adventure, at the conclusion of the service, at the completion of the journey you thought would make you wealthy and famous and free. You will become merchandise. You will become product. You will become, if you are very fortunate and very valuable, a navigational array that guides ships across dimensions no human mind was meant to perceive. I am Marcus Holloway. I was a cartographer. I am a chart now. a living chart, aware and immortal, and endlessly useful to buyers whose faces I am forbidden to describe. Theodore Wells whispers beside me in the spaces between stars. Captain Eliza Strand counts her profits in currencies that would blind mortal eyes, and somewhere, in an officer's cabin aboard the Sovereign Clarity, a new cartographer is settling into quarters with genuine wood desks and personal viewports, accepting gifts of xenos leather and bone quills and chronometers that keep time according to rhythms that are not quite human. The cycle continues, the trade continues, the transformation awaits, patient and inevitable for everyone who travels with rogue traders long enough to become truly valuable. That is the truth they do not tell you. That is the truth I have spent eternity learning to accept. That is the truth that writes itself, through whatever mechanism contains these words, into records that perhaps some future recruit will find and read and foolishly disbelieve. I was like you once, idealistic, eager, grateful for the opportunity. Look at what I have become, and know that the same fate awaits you. Look at what I have become,